Welcome back, my friends, and good afternoon. Yes, we have careered into the third and final hour of the show. I don't know where time's gone, and there's so much more yet to discuss. As I look outside the window, it is still dark, grey and gloomy. The day just frankly hasn't got going. And we have got some important, but I'm afraid some frankly grey and difficult issues to discuss. First up, I mentioned it earlier, but here we are. We've got a cost of living crisis. Our taxes are going up. Everybody's looking for savings everywhere. But it turns out that actually we seem to have plenty of cash to send to China. Yes, the Chinese communist regime. It turns out that our foreign aid budget seems to be sending them over 50 million quid in the last year, which I think most people of any sort of sensible hue would be pretty aghast at, frankly. But anyway, maybe I'm wrong on this. I'm delighted to be joined now this afternoon by Bob Seeley MP for the Isle of Wight. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Bob, a very good afternoon. Thanks for joining me on Tice Talk. So, about a year ago, one of your colleagues, Dominic Raab, said that the quantity of foreign aid to China would reduce dramatically immediately, down to less than £1 million a year. But it turns out it's still at 50 million quid. What's going on? Why has Mr. Raab got it so badly wrong?
I don't know the simple answer to that, but I think Dominic was completely right. I think the principle here, Richard, is a simple one. And by the way, good afternoon to your viewers and listeners. There's always good reason to be spending money on aid. You know, we could spend £1 billion a year on aid in Germany if we wanted to, despite their incredible wealth, by saying there's, you know, integration stuff that they need to deal with, or Ukrainian refugees. So the idea that, you know, we could be spending money in every country in the world on overseas aid. So just because something's a good idea, however, it doesn't mean that we need to be spending money, or we should be spending money on it. And I think there are some basic principles that if a country has a space program, if a country is a potentially adversarial state, if a country has a dreadful human rights record, and if a country is frankly in the top 10 economies in the world, we should be asking ourselves some pretty serious questions. Like, actually, is that a really good use of taxpayers' money? And I'm sure that these schemes can be individually justified, but on principle, I think the idea of sending foreign aid to China is not something that I think stacks up, and many of your viewers or listeners would think is a good use of public money.
Who's in charge here? I mean, can it really be that a minister of a government who's trying to save money, and, you know, where all the cash is really tight, can a minister really have approved this? Or is this being done on the nod by civil servants, senior civil servants, without ministers' authority? Because there's a real transparency issue here. And fundamentally, there's a question of, look, some foreign aid is good, and as you quite rightly say, but it must be all about quality, not quantity. Voters will lose trust in the whole concept of foreign aid if you get stuff like this going on.
I completely agree. I'll write to James tomorrow about this, because I think you've raised a really good point. And when I saw it in the media, I was concerned, because I thought we were stopping aid to China as well. I personally think there are some fundamental problems with the way we do aid in this country, regardless of whether it's 0.7 or 0.5 or 0 whatever. The committee, the international committee that agrees overseas aid, is quite strict in its criteria. And I think one of the problems, one of the reasons why aid is seen to be a contentious issue, is because we don't necessarily spend it always on the way that we would want. So what I've been suggesting now for a number of years, eventually, hopefully, people will listen, is that whatever our overseas aid budget, 0.5 or 0.7, that should include the entirety of the BBC World Service and TV, and should include all UK peacekeeping, military peacekeeping operations, because we need to expand the concept of aid. So you're talking about basic stabilization. You're not talking war fighting, but you're talking stabilization work at one end. And on the other end, you're talking about civil society development. And what's the best way to do civil society development? Well, a critical piece of that, Richard, is the free media, especially because you've got Russia Today, Chinese TV, Iranian press TV, all these propaganda outfits as well. And I think if we included peacekeeping and BBC World Service TV and radio, I think there would be, from conservative audiences especially, I think there would be a much greater sense of, okay, the aid budget is actually worthwhile and good and we should be supporting more.
Phil from Didcock has just messaged me in whilst we've been on, Bob, saying, surely if we stop foreign aid for a year, we'd get our country's finances more back in order. Charity begins at home, surely. I mean, and in fairness, I did ask the Minister, Andrew Mitchell, if he could come on the show, but we didn't get a response on that. Because I know the other side of the argument that someone like Andrew would say is, yes, but it's all about the benefits from the soft power we get internationally. Yeah. I'm not sure we get much soft power benefits from the Chinese communist regime with 50 million quid of our money in their pocket.
I don't think we do either, and I think you make a valid point. Look, we've decided as a nation, which I happen to agree with, that we have a responsibility to care for other people because we are a relatively wealthy society. You can argue about the amount, 0.7, 0.5. You can argue about the content, as I've done. But I think the principle is that we try to support other people and help where we can. But I think we also have to be realistic. Look, life-saving aid, we should not be cutting. Basic building block of societal aid we should not be cutting, because putting in fresh water in villages in Africa or Asia is really important. Life-saving emergency, life-saving relief is absolutely critical to human life and our ethical system.
But maybe, Bob,
let me just finish a point if I could, Richard. Where the aid budget starts to run into problems is when you're paying contractors a lot of money to go and be advising a government in Africa, which then, sidles up to the Chinese anyway. So there is scope in the aid budget, saving life, doing good work, but also looking at how we spend it better. And that's what I think that we should be doing.
Well, interestingly, Zach Goldsmith, a Tory peer, he responded to a question on this on Twitter. He said, none of this money goes to the Chinese state. It's for things that matter to us. Trying to close down the illegal wildlife trade, legislation to stop the import to China of illegal timber. Well, I mean, there's loads of things we'd like to spend money on, but neither of those things sound, frankly, of vital importance to British taxpayers that's going to buy us some soft power. You're on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Is this the sort of thing that comes within your remit to question and hold to account?
It does, and I'll talk to them as well this week. Look, Zach's a good bloke. He's incredibly intelligent and very smart. Clearly, he's a very, very sort of pro-ecological agenda, which is very important for the world. We get that. My only argument here is that you could make the same excuse to spend money in Germany. You could come up with similar reasons to spend the money in Canada, or you could say, look, we need to spend $1 billion a year helping homelessness in California because it's in our interest, etc.
Well, I quite like that point about what's in our interest. I mean, bluntly, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and I quite like the idea of aid for trade, where we help people. We know there's going to be a benefit back to the UK.
Okay, there is a balance. I mean, we got into a bunch of scandals in the 1990s, Richard, because there was too much trade and exchange, questionable trade and exchange for aid. So I think a separation of sorts. What I don't think is healthy is when we're ploughing money into a country and then it's voting massively against us at the UN on some pretty unhealthy ethical issues.
Perfect.
I do think there has to be some kind of link, but I wouldn't make it as crude as, for example, China has, because I think that is, again against our value system.
Thank you very much. Bob, before I let you go, I just want to get your thoughts also on another crucial issue to my listeners and viewers, which is the topic of net zero, because there's been a new referendum, there's been a new poll out conducted by YouGov, which shows that some 62% of people who express a view now want a referendum on the whole concept of net zero. I mean, this is a significant shift, and I think it's really, really important. And the reason this, of course, is becoming so important is because of all our energy bills, and people can see the link between net zero as making us net poorer, and sadly, for many people, net colder. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, look, we've committed to net zero and it is important. And there are many millions of people in this country who want us to go down that route. However, it's not a question of choosing that route, but I do think a big issue is how we go down that route. So, for example, there was a piece in the Sunday Telegraph today about the potential damage being done if we get the North Sea, this sort of super levy, wrong on North Sea oil and gas. Whether we like it or not, gas is going to be a transition fuel for 20 years. If we don't get gas from the North Sea, we're going to be having to get it from the Middle East, We're going to be more.
We've got loads of it under our feet. It's called shale gas, Bob. But your Prime Minister,
Richard,
he bodied, but let's park that. Okay,
let's park fracking for a moment and just look at North Sea as an example. We need to make sure that we get our taxation regime right here. So yes, we're going to put a super levy because they're making vast profits, or some of them are anyway. But at the same time, if we levy too much and that North Sea basin collapses because everyone withdraws billions of investment.
But let me bring you back to net zero. You say there are millions of people who want it, but there are also millions of people, Bob, who don't. And if we believe in democracy and such a fundamental issue which is affecting everybody's finances, frankly, we should have a grown-up open debate and a referendum on it.
Well, we're having a grown-up open debate, and we don't do government by referendum, Richard. And just because one poll says that people are fed up with net zero, you probably find another poll in a week's time that people say we need to go faster on greening the climate. So let's not take things out of proportion here. What I agree in principle is that we need to have a much more honest debate about this. And one of the things that has pained me is the extent to which politicians over the last 15, 20 years have virtue signaled that they're green, we need renewables, as if that simply solves the problem of where our energy is coming from. And now that the Russians have effectively attacked the European energy supply system, we are in a world of pain. And the reason why we're in a world of pain and energy prices are going through the roof is because we haven't had a serious debate in this country. In 1997, the Labour Party said we see no case for building new nuclear reactors. So we've got no new nuclear coming on stream for years. Yeah. And in fact, we are decommissioning more nuclear than we've been commissioning. We've been growing renewables at a massive offshore wind, growing them at a massive pace, but even that isn't going to be enough.
But it's not a coincidence that with the growth of renewables over the last 15 years from 0 to about 25% of our electricity capacity on a sort of average basis, electricity prices have also grown by about 9% a year. Those two things are directly linked. There is a huge cost to the British people of heading towards net zero. And it feels to me there does need to be a grown-up debate about it. Look,
well, we're having a grown-up debate now. So, I mean, when you say, let's have a grown-up debate, let's crack on with it, because that's what we're having now.
Yes, but the population needs to be able to have its say in this, because, look, we all care about the environment, we all want cleaner air, but it's about the strategic...
referendum. I get what you're saying, but there's a very simple answer.
But all the politicians in Westminster have adopted the same stance and essentially refused to allow the people to have a genuine, proper, open say. Well, look, are there better ways to reduce our emissions than just plunging towards Richard, offshore renewables?
We don't do government by weekly referendum. You know that perfectly well.
Okay, so what's your solution to have a grown-up debate about
we're having that debate. So stop calling for a grown-up debate and start taking part in it, my friend.
I am. That's what I'm doing now, but I want more than that.
Let's get on with it. Let's stop talking about having a debate and actually discuss it. We need to have... I've only been an MP for 5 years. Have we had a grown-up debate for most under New Labour and the new Tories under Cameron? No, because people were too busy virtue signalling. Labour said no to nuclear, and we couldn't do anything with nuclear because we had the coalition with the woolly Liberal Dems. Okay, then Brexit came along, etc., etc. Then the Ukraine war, and everything has hit the fan. And we are now trying to belatedly get in place a long-term energy supply solution that includes more renewables, more nuclear. There is an issue about fracking. For me, if a community wants fracking, fair enough. I wouldn't support it on the Isle of Wight if people wanted it elsewhere. There is an important lesson, as you point out, to learn from the United States. The reality is that the United States is energy self-sufficient. Why? Because they embraced fracking. And they are not in the mess that we are in because their politicians did not virtue signal. Now, you can say there is some environmental damage, for sure, but they have energy security that we don't have.
which is directly linked to being self-sufficient by their own gas, whether it's from Czech or not. And so, you accepted earlier...
What I am arguing now, because we can do something now, is that the super levy on North Sea, we have to get that right. Because if we get that wrong and the North Sea basin as an investment centre and a production centre collapses in the next few years, we are in a world of pain that is going to make the energy situation worse. So
but in reality, Bob, we've only got about 10 to 12 years worth of reserves in the North Sea of gas, as I understand. So it's going to help a bit, but we're going to need a lot more of our own energy.
We've got, okay, there's a bit more than that, but that's more the more reason to try to keep the investment up so that you continue to get gas supplies from the North Sea so that we at least don't increase our dependency on the Middle East and indeed the US, but we can decrease it at the same time of investment. I would just put a good look, I will put a positive spin on this to a certain extent. Once battery technology comes online in the next 10 years and wind becomes storable for 24, 48, 36, 24, 36, 48 hours, 60 hours, then we are going to be in a very, very different position.
How does that help 23 million gas boilers in our houses?
It doesn't right now. That's why I'm saying it is an example of strategic longer-term planning that actually in the medium term, things are looking pretty good or much better for energy resources. The problem is now, because of the decisions made 10 and 20 years ago, right now we're in stuck where we shouldn't be. And the reason for that is because politicians of that era virtue signaled rather than had the difficult conversation that you want. But the difficult conversation that you want doesn't include a weekly referendum on this, that, and the other, because that's not how the system in this country works, my friend.
But how can people trust a Prime Minister, Bob, who in his leadership campaign said he supported fracking, subject to local consent, and the moment he becomes Prime Minister, the very first thing he does is abandon that pledge and say he's not going to do pro-fracking? How can we trust our Prime Minister on that?
I think simply because of the interregnum with Liz, I think that suddenly became a very difficult issue.
But he campaigned on it. He asked people to vote for him on the basis that he was pro-fracking subject to local consent.
Okay, we are trying to deliver energy outcomes. We are putting in place strategic plans that frankly should have been done 10 or 20 years ago, a long time before I and many other people currently in Parliament were in Parliament. Our political classes, I hope, would have learnt a lesson. And the lesson, Richard, that they need to be learning is that rather than just virtue signal and try to make themselves popular, they need to have the real debates, the real conversations that people like you are rightly calling for. And I agree that we should. Overall on Rishi, okay, I think he's going to be a great Prime Minister. I think he will put us in contention in 2 years' time. Clearly, there's going to be stuff that I don't agree with him on, but I think he's potentially going to be a fantastic Prime Minister, and he's going to give us great and strong leadership, you know, notwithstanding some of the debates that we're going to have over energy supply, over foreign policy, over stuff like planning that we haven't touched on today, but obviously it's a big issue for many folks.
I get all that. I don't think the British people want our leaders to say one thing and then the moment they get elected to literally reverse some of the key things that they were elected on. I just think it's a bad look for trust in politics in general, regardless of party.
We need to be keeping our promises, which is why it is so painful that we're putting up national insurance, and I wish we weren't. Yeah. But unfortunately, we went too far, too fast under Liz, bless her, and that has limited our room for manoeuvre as well,
What hopefully we can agree on is that we need some growth in this economy. At the moment, that is in precious short supply. Bob, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your views there on both China and also the thorny issue of net zero.